Today we have some more actual history about the Texas Revolution of 1836. We will be reading the last two chapters of this book by San Jacinto soldier Creed Taylor. Tall Men with Long Rifles, the glamorous story of the Texas Revolution. This account was dictated to James T. Deshields by Creed Taylor shortly before his death in 1906. This story tells of the aftermath of the Battle of San Jacinto, including the details concerning the capture of Santa Anna, the Mexican general, the next day. As you will see, Creed Taylor claims that Santa Anna was spared only because he was a Freemason, a decision which greatly angered many of the Texans, who wanted revenge for their friends and family members who had been butchered by the so-called Napoleon of the West. The first day of a free Texas was a glorious one. As the sun arose on the morning following the battle, it seemed to me to shine with more splendor. All nature appeared more radiant and beautiful. The fields of bluebonnets, lending an azure hue to the landscape, appeared even more brilliant and fragrant. We were all happy. By daylight, the Texan camp and the nearby battlefield was a scene of activity. Groups could be seen about the campfires preparing roast beef, about all we had for breakfast. The boys were jesting and laughing as if on a holiday jaunt. Others were looking after their hobbled horses that had strayed out on the prairies, and some saddling up for a scout up the bayou. After breakfast, men were seen all over the battlegrounds, gathering up arms, accoutrements, and articles of various kinds, which the Mexicans had abandoned in their stampede the evening before, while some of the boys were amusing themselves by decorating the mules and horses with officers' sashes, ribbons, and gold tinsels. I was told that a few days after the battle, a man was seen extracting the teeth of dead Mexicans, though the stench was something fierce. Be it known, however, that this enterprising fellow was not one of our comrades, but one of those who had flocked to the battlefield after the news of victory. He was a dentist from the States, and was supplying himself with the necessary adjuncts of his profession. No one disturbed him in his gruesome work. All the boys lamented the escape of the big dog of the tan yard, as they called Santa Anna, and scouts were soon planned to scour the country for the fugitive. Early on the morning of the 22nd, C. Boston came to me and said he was going on a still hunt, with 2 or 3 fellows, and asked me to come along. Bostic and I were perhaps the youngest lads of the army, and we were the best of chums. We were comrades together at Gonzales, Concepcion, in the grass fight, and at the siege and capture of Behar, and we were very close friends. But with the lack of a suitable mount, as my horse had been shot from under me in the battle, I declined to go. After the boys left, I kept thinking that I might be missing some fine sport. I could imagine them flushing a covey of Mexicans and chasing them across the prairies. The scouting party that captured Santa Anna was composed of Joel W. Robinson, A. H. Miles, Charles P. Thompson, Joseph Vermillion, and Cyran R. Bostic, led by Color Sergeant James A. Sylvester, the gallant young man who bore the Liberty or Death flag through the Battle of San Jacinto, the only flag flown on the field by the Texans that day. In flushing the vicinity near Vince's Bayou, the Mexican general was discovered crouching in the tall grass along a small hollow. He was first sighted by Jim Sylvester, who suddenly rode upon the fugitive. The Mexican had on a corporal's uniform and was barefooted. Sylvester at once signaled his men scattered around some 400 or 500 yards away, and as they began dashing up and flourishing their guns, Santa Anna became excited, and it was at that moment that he first gave the Masonic sign of distress. Both Sylvester and Robinsons were Masons, and they understood what them funny motions meant, and this no doubt accounts for the fact that the captive was not killed on the spot. The captive was ordered to march ahead on foot towards the camp, but soon he stopped and declared that because of his bare blistered feet he could go no further, whereupon Miles drew his gun and threatened to fire if he didn't step along lively. They proceeded a half a mile further when the prisoner suddenly stopped and said, "Senor, I cannot walk barefooted any further, even though you kill me." Several of the boys leveled their guns and were ready to shoot, when Robinson interceded, saying, "Don't kill the poor fellow." He then reached down and took the hand of the prisoner and said, "Get up behind me." C. Bostic often said that he guessed that was about Santa Anna's closest call. A moment later he would have fired, and the checkered career of the famous Mexican would have ended near the spot of his great downfall. Thus Santa Anna was captured and brought into the Texan Army camp. As the party approached General Houston's headquarters, which was under a live oak tree, I hailed Bostic and said, "See, who have you got there?" "Don't know, Creed, but we think he's a big buck." This was only a few paces from the deadline, where the Mexican prisoners were being guarded. No sooner had Bostic spoken than I saw several of the prisoners salute and heard them say, "Es el presidente! Es nuestro general! It is the president! It is our general!" Hearing this, I hastened to the headquarters, and I saw and heard everything that occurred in that great moment of our country's history. On reaching the headquarters, the captive quickly slid down the horse, and was immediately led to Houston. General Almonte was the first man to approach him, and at once introduced him to General Houston, who, owing to his wound, did not rise to his feet, but did rise to a sitting posture, and very cordially extended his hand, which Santa Anna grasped as if it were of an old friend. I could not see that Santa Anna was unduly excited, though he appeared quite serious. He bore himself with an air of a fearless, I might say defiant man, although at that moment the boys, with fury depicted in their faces, were gathering from every quarter, and it was with an effort that the guards held them back. I cannot recall all the conversation between the two generals, but that interview is of record, and a matter of familiar history. I do remember that Santa Anna did not appear shaky, nor did he ask for an opiate. Meanwhile the crowd continued to gather, and threats in an undertone were heard on every side, and I believe that Santa Anna's being a Freemason was all that saved him on that day. Houston, Sherman, and many others of our officers were Masons, and while a number of them doubtless favored the execution of the red-handed monster, yet they were bound to observe their Masonic obligations. I offer this, however, as my opinion, and this idea prevailed generally among the men. Comrade Bostic stood near Santa Anna, as if still guarding the captive, watching every movement and listening attentively to all that was said. "Something seemed to give Santa Anna confidence all at once," said Bostic, "and I know now what it was. He and Houston were both Freemasons, and the prisoner made the sign of distress, which Houston, as a Mason, heeded. I was told that at the time by one of our men, who was a Mason also, and I am now certain that it was the strong tie of fraternal brotherhood that saved Santa Anna's life." One incident I distinctly remember. In the course of the interview, Santa Anna, casting his eyes about, recognized Menchaca, who had so bravely fought on the Texan side with Captain Seguin's Mexican company, and at once appealed to him for favor and kind treatment. Menchaca was a man of wit and ready repartee, and with a sardonic smile and a twinkle of the eye, he drew his hand across his throat and exclaimed, "Oh yes, I know what you would do if you had me as prisoner." This attitude of the patriotic Menchaca toward his countrymen of course served to intensify the feeling against Santa Anna, and he became more serious and somewhat agitated, and it was at this moment, as I have been reliably informed, that he gave the distress sign of a master mason. General Houston showed the distinguished prisoner the utmost consideration, even preventing the Texans from firing a salute celebrating the capture of the Mexican general, and this served to still further exasperate some of the boys, who were unfriendly to the Texan commander, and who were loudest in their demands for the Mexican captive's blood. Houston had Santa Anna's tent erected near his own, the Mexican general's bed with finest coverings placed therein, the only bed at San Jacinto, but the fallen chief slept little that night. The Texans, including General Houston, reposed on the ground, but they slept well and happy. Santa Anna was allowed to choose his body servants, and to use all the furnishings of the fine marquis. Second only to Santa Anna, General Cos was the object of supreme contempt and hatred to the men, more especially to those who had witnessed the sacrifice of Ben Milam and other comrades in San Antonio the preceding December, and had witnessed his surrender. Cos had surrendered as a prisoner of war and had never been exchanged. By the violation of this parole he forfeited all claims to leniency, and I believe to this day that he should have been marched out in front of the Mexican prisoners and shot. General Almonte was one of the most attractive men among the prisoners. He was a man of fine appearance, genial and highly educated. He had visited Texas a few years before the outbreak of hostilities, and he remembered many of his captors whom he had met before, and for each of these he had pleasant words. I had it from good authority that Almonte was not his right name. I was told that his father was the insurgent priest who first raised the Grito for Mexican independence in 1810. At one time later during the ensuing war, Hidalgo and the lad with a small escort were riding along the highway, when suddenly they found themselves almost surrounded by the Spanish troops, under Callega. Hidalgo, seeing the capture inevitable, shouted to the boy, Al monte! Al monte! To the hills! To the hills! The boy fled as directed, and was ever afterward known as Almonte. One more little incident of San Jacinto, and I will have done with my poor accounts of some of the things I saw there, although the event I am going to relate occurred a day or so after I left, but it was told to me by several of the boys who were eyewitnesses. A large amount of ammunition had been captured, among which were quite a lot of cartridges gathered up loose and piled in a heap not far from Santa Anna's tent, which was guarded by a sentinel in front and one in the rear. Tom Nail was on duty that day as guard at the rear of Santa Anna's tent, and no man ever breathed that hated the Mexican chief more than Tom. By some means during that day, fire got out in the dry grass, and reached the pile of cartridges with the result that there was a furious and prolonged explosion. It sounded like the continued rattle of musketry, and produced quite an excitement in the camp. Hearing the uproar, Santa Anna got the idea that there was an uprising of the prisoners, and rushing to the rear of his tent, he bent low to the ground, and raising the cloth, put his head out to see what was going on. Sentinel Nail was carrying a Mexican escopeta with a fixed bayonet, and when he saw Santa Anna's head poked out, he made a vicious lunge at it with his bayonet, which, missing its mark, buried itself to the gun muzzle in the ground. Of course the general's head got back quicker than it came out, but until the day of his death, Tom Nail cursed his ill luck in not pinning Santa Anna's head to the ground on that occasion. Strange to say, our histories of Texas say little or nothing about the disposition of the Mexican dead at San Jacinto, and the question is often asked if they were buried. As stated, they were not buried but left to decay where they fell, but the sequel proved that these carcasses should have been buried or burned. Dead Mexicans lay everywhere and in every position. It was a ghastly sight I can never forget. Santa Anna evinced no desire to have his slain men interred, and of course we Texans were not concerned about their final disposition. The fact is that the immediate burial of so large a number of corpses was rendered impracticable by the great fatigue which the Texans had endured, and by the care of the prisoners and captured army property. Soon the bodies, drenched by the heavy rains and heated by the burning sun, presented a fearful, most ghastly sight, swelling to enormous sizes, and decaying with a revolting stench. No one of course wanted to engage in the gruesome work, the boys saying that they came to kill but not to bury Mexicans, and it was jocosely suggested that a dead Mexican would turn to a mummy anyhow, that there was not vitality enough about them to cause decomposition, that at the Alamo and at Goliad our dead were burned, but that we would be more humane and leave the unfortunate Mexicans to rest in peace on the field. I have often heard the story of how a Mrs. McCormick, on whose estate the principal portion of the slain Mexicans lay, called at General Houston's headquarters, and requested him to have them stinking Mexicans removed from her lands. The general with mock seriousness replied, "Madam, your land will be famed in history as the classic spot upon which the glorious victory of San Jacinto was won. Here that last scourge of mankind, the arrogant self-styled Napoleon of the West, met his fate." "To the devil with your glorious history," the madam replied. "Take off your stinking Mexicans." No buzzards or wolves came about them, and the odor exuding from the corpses which lay rotting south of our camp became terrible, causing the army to move up to Harrisburg. After the flesh rotted off, the cattle pawed over and chewed the bones to the extent that their milk and meat was unfit for use. The citizens of the vicinity then gathered up and buried the bones, all except the skulls, which could not be chewed. The skulls lay on the ground, and some of them could be seen many years later. Some of them were carried away as souvenirs, but I never had any desire for such relics. On the eve of the Battle of San Jacinto, General Houston had made a short talk, telling us that if we fought hard and won victory, we would all be captains. The fighting was indeed hard. The result, a glorious victory that ensured the independence of Texas from a powerful nation, and of course we all did feel like we were captains. The dictator of all Mexico was now a humble captive in our camp. The spoils of war were ours, and our joy knew no bounds. But after a few days of carousing, gadding, and gossiping, the novelty of the situation wore off, and we began to tire of idle camp life. Now that the campaign was ended and the Mexican army was overthrown, my thoughts were of peace, loved ones, and home. And so Josiah and I bid farewell to our comrades in camp, and went back to Mother and the children. The gladsome news of the victory had already reached them, and what a change! It would be impossible for me to tell how happy the folks were. Those were the happiest days of my life. The forests and the prairies were in full green, and looked inexpressibly lovely. The birds seemed to sing a new song of gladness, and all nature appeared in holiday attire. In a few days we were all on the homeward march, but the return trip was a very different one from the hurry-scurry runaway. Mother was as jovial as a girl at a ball, and the children were enlivened by a spirit of gaiety. The real secret was we were going back home. The Mexicans had been whipped, and we had nothing to fear at their hands any more. As we pushed forward, the days seemed shorter, and the distance ahead seemed greater than ever before. We had only a small stock of provisions, jerked beef, parched corn, but we didn't feel the pangs of hunger. The night after we crossed the Colorado, floods of rain fell, and we became thoroughly soaked, but we didn't mind the rain. We were going home. We overtook many other refugees who were returning home, and they too, without exception, were in high spirits. We expected to find nothing but ashes and a heap of ruins where we had left our homes and shelter. But now this could be borne with resignation, since Texas was free, and the Mexican power was forever broken. Under the protection of our own rule, and with land at peace, we could soon rebuild our homes, replenish our herds, and as for the Indians, we could cope with them. I think it was on the 10th or 12th of May that we reached home, late in the evening, and we found the house and the outbuildings intact. But the vandals had been there, and little of value remained. Fires had been made in the yard, feathers were scattered about the premises, and bones of fowls scattered round told too plainly where Mother's chickens had gone. Our rude furniture was broken, and the few books she had left on the side shelf were gone. The crib and the smokehouse were empty. The doors were broken from their wooden hinges. The festering remains of old Lep, the faithful watchdog, were lying just inside the door of the dwelling. Whether he died defending the entrance, or starved, or was killed and his body thrown there, will never be known. That night we repaired the old broken table, and at supper we gathered once more around the festal board, which was lightly burdened with a scant supply of dried beef, while our beverage was water drunk from a Spanish gourd. But to us it was a joyful feast, because we were at home. Next morning our joy was increased when we found that some of our neighbors had returned, and 2 weeks later they gathered from far and near at our house and danced all night. We were celebrating our recent great victory in the manner of that day and time. We were happy, hopeful, and willing to work hard, now that we lived in our own free country. Privations were forgotten in the hopes of better times. We made a very good crop of corn that year, although late in planting. Our stock on the range had not been molested to any great extent, and it took us but a few years to regain what losses we had sustained in the great runaway scrape. After the War of Independence and the launching of the Republic, frontier expansion began, and with that movement came more war. That long and bitter strife between the determined frontiersmen and the infuriated Indians for mastery of the country. Complete peace for Texas did not come for many a year. In this sanguinary struggle of half a century, the Comanches were the most warlike and troublesome. They were lords of the realm, and were constantly swooping down from their mountain strongholds, and depredating all along our exposed frontier. A ranger force must be constantly maintained, and men who were able and willing to campaign in that fast-riding and hard-fighting troop were needed. Having tired of the environments and monotony of civil life, I determined to join the Rangers, and so mounting my best horse I rode down to Victoria, and enlisted in Captain David E. Murphy's company. Shortly after this, learning that Captain Bird Lockhart's company of Rangers was under orders to go to San Antonio, and wishing to revisit the scenes of my recent conflicts, I transferred to this troop. We immediately set out for Behar, and in due time arrived at the Alamo, whose walls and floors had recently been crimsoned with the blood of martyred comrades. The scene of desolation around the old fortress, the evidence of the terrible conflict, and the silence which seemed to brood over the scene of the late carnage, was indescribable. Strong men of our own company, men who had brothers of other relatives and friends who fell with Travis, wept as little children when they were shown dark red stains on the mute stones of this Thermopylae of Texas, and there was none to give them comfort in their silent grief. At this time, on a corner building near the Alamo appeared large charcoal pictures of Bowie and Crockett. Crockett was holding a long-barreled rifle, and Bowie was firing a pistol. Another drawing, without any name, but with a drawn sword, was no doubt intended for Travis, and still another of these caricatures may have been intended for Bonham. Historian Yoakum gives Colonel Seguin and his command the credit for having collected and buried the ashes of the Alamo victims. On the morning after Lockhart's company arrived, orders were given to make search for the remains of the Alamo men, in order that they might receive Christian burial. I claim to be one of the first to discover the spot where these martyrs to liberty were cremated. Near the Alamo we discovered a dim trail, which led us to the spot about 1/2 or 3/4 mile northeast from the fortress. And what a sad sight! The heaps of burned bones told the story of Mexican cruelty. In a long row the bodies of the Texans had been stacked. First a layer of wood and inflammable substances, then a layer of men, and so on alternately until all the bodies had been prepared for the poorly arranged cremation, when the pile was ignited. The wood being shorter than the bodies, in many instances the skeletons remained only partially destroyed, which made more terrible the hideous sight. I reported the discovery to Captain Lockhart, who had the remains carefully collected and placed in a large, neat black coffin, with the names of Bowie, Travis, Crockett, and Bonham engraved upon a metallic tablet, and attached to the inside of the lid. A solemn procession was then formed, and the coffin was tenderly borne to the military cemetery, where appropriate ceremonies were performed, and orations delivered, after which the remains of the immortal heroes of the Alamo were buried with military honors. I have found that writers on Texas history do not agree in their reports of that funeral. In a published letter written by Juan N. Seguin in 1878, he says that he collected the remains of the Alamo victims and placed them in an urn and buried them near the altar in San Fernando Cathedral. Several years ago, my attention was called to an account of the obsequies as published in the Texas Register in 1837. Both of these accounts are at variance with the facts. It is well known that Seguin took command at Behar in the retirement of the Mexican troops shortly after the Battle of San Jacinto. The remains of the Alamo victims were not collected and buried until February 25, 1837. Why did Seguin wait 10 months before gathering up the charred remains of his old comrades and give them Christian burial? The truth is, Colonel Seguin took no steps toward this matter until the arrival of our company, and then showed his indifference in diverse ways. He seemed not to know even where the heaps of these remains were, and made no effort to aid us in locating them. And when they were at last found, collected, and prepared for burial, no one thought of consulting Seguin as to how or where they should be laid to rest. The account in the Texas Register is far-fetched and overdrawn. The only music I heard was that of a bugle. There was a procession, but on a scale quite humble as compared to that recorded by the Register. At the grave in the old military cemetery we heard speeches. I do not remember who the orators were. The coffin was then lowered and 3 volleys fired over the open grave. Others to the contrary, these are the facts. Perverted statements should not mar a country's history, nor be used in eulogizing its heroes. Delving thus far into the past, and speaking of this memorable event brings vividly forth many memories of stirring scenes of the long ago. 70 years have rolled away. Since that day I rode into Behar and assisted in collecting and performing the last sad rites over these immortal heroes. And though in point of time far removed from the occurrences of that unparalleled struggle and heroic defense, yet as the scenes of the terrible conflict pass in panoramic review, aged as I am, my old blood warms and courses through my veins. With quickening flow I feel the stirring impulses of youth, and would again heed the call to arms. But again as I reflect, though time has dealt gently with me, and I am spared to the living from that chivalric era of fierce strife and carnage, I well know my life is drawing to a close, that I am fast approaching the border of another, an unknown land, and that ere long I must cross over and join my old comrades in arms. And now the drama closes, the curtain comes down, and my story ends. So that's it for this episode about the final events of the Texas Revolution. Creed Taylor would serve for several years with the Texas Rangers. He mentioned in this story Josiah, who was his younger brother, going home with him after the battle. Josiah was only 14 years old at the time of these events. They also had another brother named Pitkin Taylor who was about 13 years old, and it appears that he did not serve in the army. After the Civil War, the Taylors were involved in the Taylor-Sutton feud, and at times they allied with John Wesley Hardin. We might do an episode on that feud in the future on this channel. I will also post a link to a short video we did on this channel over 2 years ago about how General Almonte's father, Father Hidalgo, started the Mexican Revolution in 1810. Mexico would achieve its independence from Spain in 1821, and in 1824 they would enact their constitution that was closely modeled off the U.S.'s constitution. After this, many Anglo settlers began moving to Texas, and the Texas Revolution began after Santa Anna abolished the Constitution of 1824. It is often said that Sam Houston spared Santa Anna's life because Santa Anna would be more useful alive than dead. Killing Santa Anna may have encouraged the Mexicans to again try to subdue the Texans. However, Creed Taylor said that Santa Anna was saved because he gave the Masonic sign of distress, and several Masons, including Sam Houston, spared him due to their Masonic obligation. Let us know in the comments what you think about Santa Anna's life being spared. After reading Creed Taylor's account, it seems to me that these Freemasons in the Texas Army were placing their Masonic duties above that to their fellow Texans, who had been killed by Santa Anna and deserved vengeance. But perhaps Sam Houston thought about some of the other reasons to spare Santa Anna, and it wasn't only due to him being a Freemason. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel we keep this worthy history alive by reading directly from old books, written down long ago, by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support the mission of this channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your name will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.